I'm in a crappy band with some old high school buddies of mine. A few weeks ago, our bassist Pierce informed the rest of the band that his parents had flown to Europe and left their house for us in Fort Collins. His dad is a sound engineer and has a recording studio in the house. We were ecstatic. So we packed light and made the drive from California to Fort Collins, ready to track a backlog of 8 songs we had been sitting on. It was mid-spring, and the mountains looked like they were jutting out from oceans of blue and yellow wildflowers. The drive was long, but it was nothing short of spectacular. In fact, it was so beautiful that one night after a recording session, Pierce suggested that we go camping. I laughed at the idea. They all knew I had a somewhat negative experience in the Colorado Rockies a few years ago. But Ronnie and Jeff jumped on board and insisted I not be a wet blanket about it. Pierce recommended some vanilla tent camping at the foot of the mountain, but Ronnie had a bright idea. He wanted to do some astrophotography, and for that, he said, we needed to go to a place that's really dark. So we spent some time Googling and discovered Comanche Peak Wilderness, a remote section of a popular national park. What a great idea, I remember chirping. Why, surely nothing could go wrong. Of course stuff could go wrong, and it started on the drive up there. People always forget that evening begins at around 4 p.m. in the deep woods. As soon as the sun dips behind the treetops, the gloom sets in and things get eerie. Nothing makes me more claustrophobic than the sight of that heavy murk sliding over the world. My body rejects it because my brain knows it's too early for dark. I was on edge the second that paved road gave way to dirt. The other thing people forget is just how loud the woods are at times, and how silent they become at others. The contrast between them can make your head spin. One moment it's a symphony of owls and crickets and toads, then a branch will snap, or thunder will crack, and suddenly you're wondering if you've gone deaf. And then of course, if you think about it too much, you realize just how full the darkness is with all those watchful eyes. We went in as deep as we could. We ditched Pierce's truck on the side of some forgotten road and hiked about a half mile into the trees. There was no trail. We followed the GPS to a tiny lake nestled somewhere uphill, where Ronnie could set up his camera and get a clear view of the night sky. We hadn't crossed a solitary soul after entering the preserve a few hours prior, and I felt apprehensive about the fact that no one knew where we were. By dusk, we had set up the 2 tents Pierce had borrowed from his parents. We made a small bonfire pit between them and strung up all our food in the trees like you're supposed to do. Ronnie set up his camera along the shore, and then we waited for nightfall. My anxiety worsened as darkness ate away at the sky. The guys didn't notice. They drank and smoked and carried on. And right when the world went black, leaves began to crunch in the distance behind our tents. A girl emerged from the tree line and stopped at the edge of our little clearing. This girl was probably 8 years old and wore a white dressing gown, like she had just woken up. She had platinum blonde, almost white hair, and skin so pale she looked like a ghost in the firelight. She wasn't carrying a flashlight or anything. She had just been walking in the pitch-black woods. She squinted at our fire as if it annoyed her, and let out a few wet coughs. We all just stared at each other in confusion while she studied us. There were no roads or trails in this area. This was not a campground. Her presence made no sense. Jeff eventually called out to her, asking if she was okay, and she replied, "My mommy's sick. Can you guys help us?" Where is she?" Jeff asked. The girl just pointed back into the forest. The trees and shadows and mist clustered together to form a great big wall of nope. I gave Jeff a subtle hell no headshake. You might call me a coward, but I'm not about to get disappeared by some malevolent wood pixie. Ronnie stood up and asked the girl if they were camping or if they had a house or something. The girl just replied, "She's really sick. Just follow me." At this point, all four of us seemed to sense that something was wrong. Pierce, probably the cleverest of us, invited the girl to come warm up by the fire and explain what was going on. I think he knew she'd decline. The girl just turned and walked back into the woods, coughing as she went. Before she vanished, she turned around and said something, but we couldn't be certain of what. I heard, "So you'll be a liar." But Ronnie heard, "Soon you'll meet the liar." We built the fire up a lot more, mostly to keep a good perimeter against the darkness. All of us were creeped out, but after a few hours the guys had mostly forgotten about the girl. They laughed and told stories about drunken escapades. At some point, Jeff and I went to a tree line to relieve ourselves. I walked about 10 steps into the woods and blasted the darkness with my flashlight. Jeff followed closely behind. I wanted to see if there was a clearing on the other side of the woods, or a footpath that the girl might have followed. But there was nothing. Just a snarl of impassable trees. We heard Ronnie shouting something, so Jeff and I jogged back to the fire and saw him examining the southern edge of the clearing. That was the direction we had left the truck in. Pierce said as we passed by, he thinks he heard some more footsteps. I could hear them too. Standing next to Ronnie, I could make out a new pair of feet trampling the leaves in the dark. It was louder than the girls had been, probably bigger. "Show yourself!" Ronnie shouted. "We have guns." To my surprise, a woman answered him. She laughed and said, "Don't shoot, I'm just a hiker." We moved back and watched her step into the clearing. She was probably in her late 30s and wore a raggedy hat and an old beat-up pack. I remember hearing Pierce grumble something like, "Real private spot you found here, Ronnie," and I agreed. How the hell were all these people just bumping into us way out here? The woman introduced herself as Sarah and apologized for scaring us. Ronnie demanded to know what she was doing out here, and she explained that she had done the full day loop around the mountain, but had gotten lost for a little while. She claimed to have found her bearings and now knew where she was going. "You know the way back?" he repeated to her. "Yep." "In the dark, without a flashlight?" "Uh-huh. I know this area pretty well," she said. Ronnie wasn't buying a word of it. He turned back to the rest of us and said, "We're getting cased, you guys. We're probably gonna get robbed soon as we fall asleep. Campers get killed by thieves and meth heads all the time." "Well, thanks for bringing us out here, dingus," Jeff said. Sarah laughed again. She was real smiley for a woman lost in the woods. In the dark. "I swear it's nothing like that," she said. "Look, fine, I'll be on my way." For whatever reason, I felt the urge to press her further. So I said, "You know, you're not the only person we've met out here who's walking around without a light." That little smile fell off of Sarah's face, and it took the wind right out of my sails. She stared at me like she could see down into the deepest places inside me. "You met the little girl?" she asked with a blank expression. My bandmates all exchanged looks of incredulity. Sarah collected herself and a new smile spread across her face. She said, "Don't listen to anything that little brat says. She's a liar through and through. Look, why don't you guys come down to the ranger station with me? It'll be safer together." She pointed behind herself into the woods. Something lit up in my brain. This was the second time a stranger had tried to coax us into the dark. We weren't going to get robbed. Something much worse was about to happen. Pierce seemed to have come to the same conclusion. and he invited Sarah to instead join us around the fire. As he did with the little girl, he knew Sarah would decline. The strange woman told us she had to get back before it got any colder. And with that, she turned and hurried into the woods. After a long debate about what to do, we decided that hiking back to the truck was the fastest way to get lost or killed. We hadn't used a trail and our phone batteries were low. Every time the wind blew, it set 1,000 trees groaning and shivering, which made it impossible to orient ourselves by sound. And it was so black that if I stared into the darkness long enough, I started having minor hallucinations as my brain tried to make sense of the void. So we kept the fire blazing and agreed to sleep in two-person shifts. Since Pierce and I were the soberest of the bunch, we agreed to stay up first. But only an hour into our watch, we started hearing the coughs and sputters of the little girl in the distance. I followed Pierce to the lake's edge, which lay about 30 yards from our camp. There, we heard an eerie voice wafting on the breeze. I saw the silhouette of a person milling about near the water a few hundred feet away, and realized it was the girl. She was wandering around in the dark, singing. We booked it back to the fire and woke Jeff and Ronnie up, alerting them to the girl's presence. But as we discussed what to do, another voice erupted from nearby and began singing as well. It sounded like Sarah. Pierce and I jumped into the tent with the other guys and sealed it up, terrified that the time had come for whatever these creeps had planned. But no one approached our camp. The two people just walked in slow half circles behind the trees, singing together in a language I couldn't identify. Ronnie always keeps a menacing-looking trail knife on him whenever we go hiking, and he scrambled for it while shouting that he'd butcher anybody who came near us. His yelling caused the people outside to go quiet for a few moments. I pulled out my phone to record some of the voices, but my hands were shaking so hard I could barely operate it. I caught a little bit of the girl. But then, something even weirder happened. None of us are certain how many people were in the woods, but we heard a third voice at that moment. It was deeper and guttural, like the sound of some night predator stalking around in the jungle. I'm not certain the noise was made by a person. Ronnie and Jeff believe the sound is coming from the little girl, who has a coughing fit and then begins channeling some demonic voice. Pierce and I think it's a third person or an animal that was with them, waiting for us to leave the safety of the bonfire. I'm going to play the recording for you now, so I apologize for the poor quality. After the commotion, the activity in the woods died down for a while. The guys and I remained inside the tent, terrified, only leaving its shelter to throw more wood on the fire about once an hour. None of us slept, and for the rest of the night, we occasionally heard distant singing, laughing, coughing, and the occasional whisper. Sometimes the girl would say, "Can you help us?" in the exact same tone, as if her voice had been recorded and replayed over and over again. We also heard someone, probably Sarah, climbing a nearby tree and shouting things like, "I can see you, boys!" and "Let's go together, it's safe now!" And that was it. By dawn, we were exhausted from terror and half frozen in the tent. The noises stopped and the people, if they even were people at all, had long abandoned their efforts to lure us into the dark. We packed up and hiked back to the truck, which had thankfully not been ransacked. As far as I'm concerned, the next time I go camping, it'll be in a treeless desert in Arizona. I guess I'm what you could call a sort of freelance investigative journalist. Basically, what my job is, I go around investigating various locations and people for businesses. I research, travel, record my findings, then send them off to whoever is employing me at the time. I don't work for one specific news outlet, so that frees me up to accept multiple jobs from almost everywhere. A lot of the time, certain companies will prefer a freelancer over, say, someone on company time, either due to bias or risk. They often want someone they could wash their hands of if something went wrong. Personally, I didn't mind that reason. One, because I'm very good at my job. And two, I get to set my price range. Over the years, I've investigated numerous people and places. From your average unfaithful husband to shady politicians and even greedy businessmen. I've traveled across the United States more times than I can count. Some people have paid me to locate lesser-known vacation spots even. There aren't many, but there are some that are still pretty secret to the world. Travel medias have sent me to various cities and states to give them a fresh take on the civilization there. The food, the people, the hotels, the sights, you name it. Most companies find me by word of mouth and contact me through various means. Email, phone, letter, bat signal. Once contacted, I review the job and then send them my terms, and they either reply or they don't. A few weeks ago, I was sent a small package in the mail. It's not unusual for a company to contact me this way, so I grabbed the rather thick envelope and brought it inside. As I sat there watching the news and sipping my morning coffee, I gingerly opened the package and peered inside. Money. A lot of money. I was shocked by the amount, as I had never been given this much before, and certainly not up front. A letter was placed inside and I quickly fished it out. I read and reread the letter a few times to make sure I was fully understanding it properly. The gist of it was, this company wanted me to investigate a town. It gave me a detailed list of directions to get there. But what was odd was when I searched it on the internet, nothing came up. It was as if the town didn't exist. The letter went on to explain that something had happened in the town, and I was tasked with finding out what. It mentioned that regardless of my findings, that another payment of the exact same amount will be granted to me upon completion. I took some time to look up the company that sent the letter, and big surprise, they were just as non-existent as the town. This was either some sort of scam or something worse. On one hand, I knew nothing about this place or these people, so it made me very nervous. But on the other, it was a lot of money. The letter did say regardless of my findings, so I thought that I could just cheese the rules a bit. I could go to this town, drive around for a little while, leave, and collect payment. So that's precisely what I planned to do. I packed my bags, hopped in my car, and hit the open road. The town in question was quite far from where I lived, but the money negated the distance. I drove from state to state until finally I entered the proper one. As I drew nearer and nearer to my destination, I couldn't help but feel trepidation swell within me. I scanned the letter the closer I got just to make sure I hadn't missed any turnoffs. After about 3 more hours of driving, I found the road that would lead me to this town. It was around midday as I turned onto the road, and the sky seemed to have been taken over by thick gray clouds as I drove. The overcast gave all the surroundings a sort of muted coloring, like the life had been drained from nearly everything. The plants, the ground, the trees, the road, the signs. Everything was dull. A few moments later, I was passing by the sign to the town. Buildings started to appear on the horizon. A gas station, a few outlying shops, then the houses. A few at first, then more becoming densely packed together as I neared the center of the town. The first thing I noticed as I drove through this town was that there were absolutely no inhabitants. At least, none that I could see. Cars were parked along roads and in driveways. The houses were all closed up with no lights on. None of the buildings looked to be boarded up, just empty. I'm not sure if you've ever been in a ghost town before, but the mystery of it is enough to chill you to the bone. I pondered the letter I had received. Could my employer know the current state of the town? Was this the reason I was sent here? To discern the cause of it? I have investigated many things, but this was quickly expanding beyond my pay grade. I also began to wonder why it was I that was chosen. Surely this could have been investigated by more professional means, like the police or the government. It didn't really make sense to outsource a job like this. As I was lost in thought driving along, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. I stopped the car and looked, but nothing was there. It just seemed to be a flash of movement, but it passed. I was almost at the center of the town, and I decided that once I hit that mark, I'd turn around and leave, telling my client that I couldn't find anything. Sure, it was cheap of me to do so, but my entire body was screaming for me to get out. Just as I pulled up to the central intersection, my worst fear came to fruition. My car's engine sputtered for a few feet, then died. I gripped the wheel tightly, staring straight ahead, not wanting to acknowledge my incompetence. I removed the keys from the ignition and looked around. The sky had darkened significantly by this point. It gave my surroundings an almost black and white hue to them. I opened the car door and stepped out onto the street. I pulled my phone from my pocket, but for some reason it wouldn't turn on. It was as if it had been completely drained of its battery life. I took a few steps and leaned against my car, wondering if I should begin walking back the way I came. Just then, I felt a chill drape around my shoulders. My breath visibly left my shaking lips. A voice in the back of my head screaming at me to not turn and look around. I just shifted my eyes downward and glared at the ground, shivering and sweating both at the same time. In my peripheral vision, I could see legs. There were people all around me, but they weren't touching the ground. They were all hovering, suspended a few inches off the asphalt, the tips of their shoes gently grazing the ground below. My head snapped up and I saw them. The town. All of the people that had vanished were now before me. They all hovered with their heads lulled to the ground. All of them seemed to be facing various directions and they all weren't moving. Just floating there. Stationary. I could feel the strain on my lids as my eyes would not shut. I was too frightened by the sight before me. They were all wearing normal clothing. Nothing on their person appeared to have been altered. That is, aside from their faces. I had the only pair of eyes in town. Darkened holes of torn flesh rested right above the nose on all of them. Some had blood dripping down their cheeks, others didn't. I wasn't sure why. Through this sea of horror, I saw something shifting in the distance. My eyes began to focus on it, and between the people, I saw it. It was standing near one of the townsfolk. It was holding them close to it, with two spindly hands. It was nearly as tall as the people floating around it. It had its back turned to me and was doing something to the person in front of it. The eerie silence was filled with the wet crunches of fractured bone and the gnawing of flesh. I felt my shaking hands lose grip of my car keys and they fell towards the asphalt. The ringing of the metal seemed to echo for miles. This snapped me out of my fixation, and I bent down to pick them up. As I stood back up, all of the townspeople were now facing towards me. Standing between them was that thing. It was cloaked in shadow, and its face was grotesque. Skin so tight it might as well have just been bone. It had piercing yellow eyes that cut through the muted colors around us. It was chomping down on something with sharp, blackened teeth. I knew right away what it was eating, as the person who it was previously interacting with was looking at me with only one eye. It twitched its head from left to right, like an insect, before coming towards me. It moved as if it had 100 legs, but I couldn't see any. It was just gliding in jagged directions. I pulled open my car door, got inside, and locked everything. I put my keys back into the ignition and turned them. No sound. I tried once more. Nothing. I tried a third time, and I heard a tapping on my glass. I turned and was face to face with it. A long, barbed tongue stretched from its mouth and raked along my window. It sounded like nails on a chalkboard. I screamed. I had never been more terrified in my entire life. I begged to as many gods as I knew about to please just let me leave this place. I tried the key one last time, and the engine roared to life. I put it in reverse and floored it. The wheels and axles screamed under the torque. I expected to plow through all the floating people around me, but as soon as I began to move, they disappeared. I drove for days without stopping before making it home. I sent a letter to the address that the company had given me, telling them down to the smallest detail what I had experienced. I wondered what they would do, if they'd simply reply or what. Then, a few days ago, I received another letter in the mail. It was from the same company, thanking me for my work. They enclosed the other half of my payment and told me to reply if I would like more work. I burned that letter shortly after reading it. I'm sure some of you have noticed that I've left out some details of this story, such as the town's name and the state I found it in. That's because I never want anyone to seek that place out. However, if you do happen to stumble across a town where all the inhabitants have seemingly gone missing, turn around and drive away before you become one of them. As for me, well, I have enough money that I can take a break from my job for a while. Hopefully long enough to stop seeing those awful yellow eyes in my dreams. When I first stepped through the door, I was utterly captivated. This house seemed to be just the place I was looking for. The location was perfect. Not too far away from the main town and not completely out in the sticks either. It was settled on the edge of a dead-end street. The neighboring houses were quite spaciously placed, which gave each house a decent amount of land. Being the house at the far end, however, gave me the most. The front lawn was expansive, as well as the sides of the house. The backyard, however, was by far the largest of the land. It stretched far outward, butting up against a small cluster of trees, making a sort of natural wall. The land was only one small piece of this prize, however. The house itself was huge. A 2-story house with 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and an incredible kitchen and living room. It was easily the largest house I had ever lived in or would be living in. My family was quite impoverished growing up. We lived in a small 2-bedroom house in the less than popular part of the city. After working non-stop and bouncing from one apartment to the next, it was finally time to get something a bit more permanent. The realtor I was working with was an older woman who had dirty blonde hair with a few gray streaks pulled back into a tight bun. She had a very stern expression on her face at times, but when she spoke about the house, she seemed to radiate happiness. I could tell she had been at this profession for a while. When I asked her about the history of the house, her face twisted into a grim expression for a moment before softening. She told me that a few minor incidents had occurred to the previous residents, but quickly deflected that statement, saying that it was nothing to worry about. Hearing this, however, still piqued my interest. I wanted to know more about it, but each time I tried to press her on the matter, she'd just smile and change the subject. Eventually, I started to pull back my desires for the house, and I think she could sense this. Not wanting to lose out on a sale, with a heavy sigh, she told me that the previous family had been hearing strange noises outside the house at night. When I asked her what kind of noises, she said that they described it like a wild animal. They had animal control come out a few times to look for it, but there were no signs of any animals near the house. She went on to say that they had 2 young children with them, and the sounds were scaring them so bad they wanted to move. When she finished speaking, her stern face reformed into a chipper disposition, and she continued on with the tour. Once the tour was over, she looked at me and asked me what I thought. I'll be honest, when I heard about the reasons behind the sale, I was a bit taken aback. However, a few animal sounds at night would hardly deter me from buying this place. I told her I'd accept, and we finalized everything in the coming week. I had been living in this house for 2 months before I heard the noise for myself. I had just gotten into bed and was setting my alarm for the night when I heard a scratching sound coming from outside my window. I quietly got out of bed and walked over to my window. As I approached, the sound steadily grew in volume, and I gently peeled back the curtain. Nothing was out there. I couldn't see anything outside except for a dark backyard and some trees at the edge. I stood there for a minute or two looking around, before finally heading back to bed. A week later, I heard that same scratching sound once again, but this time something else was accompanying it. It sounded like muffled growling, like a feral animal had wandered up against my house. Hearing this was somewhat disconcerting, but I didn't feel frightened. Honestly, I probably wouldn't have even heard it if I hadn't been on the cusp of falling asleep. I thought perhaps a wild dog had come up to the house looking for food. I sluggishly got out of bed and once again walked over to my window. As I peeled the curtain back, I saw something. A shadow moving in the distance. What was odd was that the thing I saw was walking on 2 legs. A bear? I thought. No, it was too small and moving too quickly to be a bear. Before I could make out what it was, it had melded with the darkness and had disappeared. I stood there wide-eyed for nearly 10 minutes before dropping the curtain. I was beginning to think that there might have been more to this than just some wild animal. The next morning, I stood out on my back porch and just stared at the trees near my backyard. I wondered what that thing could have been. After an hour of mindlessly staring, I went back inside. For about a month, the sound seemed to have stopped. I thought that perhaps whatever it was had gotten bored with this house and left for greener pastures. Then, at the beginning of this month, the sounds had come back. It was roughly 1 o'clock in the morning and I was already deep asleep when I was suddenly stirred awake. As my eyes cracked open, I recognized the sound. It was the sound of tapping on glass. The rhythmic thumps on the pane reverberated throughout my silent room. I didn't want to go investigate. My body was too overcome with anxiety. Eventually, the tapping subsided and I gathered my composure to go over to the window. As I peeked out of the edge, I caught a glimpse of that same figure in the distance. Only this time it wasn't moving. It was standing completely still, like a statue in the dark. The only reason I could see it in the first place was due to the faint bit of starlight breaking up its silhouette. It then seemed to shrink in the distance, as if it were getting smaller before fading entirely from view. By this point, I was officially unnerved. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a mindless beast. I took care to make sure all my windows and doors were locked before heading back to sleep. Over the following days, the sounds would come and go intermittently. Most of the time, I'd just bury my head in the pillow to drown out the noise, because whenever I'd get up to go look, I'd either not see anything, or just catch a glimpse of that fading silhouette. Last week, I heard the sounds as usual. The scratching, growling, and tapping on the window. I had gotten up to investigate, and when I peeled back the window this time, I had a flashlight with me. I sent the beam of light out into the darkness, hoping it would allow me to see whatever it was. The light only caught a faint bit of movement near the ground at the edge of my backyard. After not seeing anything further, I shut the light off and went back to bed. The next morning, after I had gotten dressed, I stepped out onto my backyard. I kept a close eye on the tree line as I made my way over to where I had seen the movement last. As I walked over a particular spot, the ground below my feet seemed to give slightly. Walking in this area seemed unnatural. Upon taking a few more steps on the grass, my foot seemed to catch the edge of something. I inspected the ground much more closely and found something buried in the grass. It was a metal ring. Confused, I pulled it towards me and found that it was connected to the grass. I pulled it a bit harder, and then the entire ground before me seemed to open up. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was now a large hole in the ground at the edge of my backyard. As soon as my eyes could understand what I was looking at, the smell hit me next. It was horrid. A rancid mix of rot and excrement filled my nostrils. I took a few steps backwards, gasping for air. I wasn't sure what was causing the smell, nor did I want to find out for myself. So I went inside and called the police. It took them nearly 30 minutes to arrive at my house. All the while I stood on my back porch watching that hole. When the officers arrived, I explained to them my situation and what I thought I had found. The two officers gave each other looks of assurance before walking over to the entrance of that hole. I kept a healthy distance as I watched them cover their mouths before hopping down inside. I waited for what felt like hours before one of the officers emerged from that hole, followed by the other. They both gagged and gasped for air, and I had retrieved some water from my kitchen for them. After a few minutes of gaining their composure, they radioed this in, and soon an entire forensic team had come out to investigate. The two original officers took me aside and told me what they had found. They said that they had found an entire living area down in that hole. Someone had apparently dug out a little hovel and had been living down there for quite some time. When I asked if the person was still down there, they both looked to one another once more and shook their heads. They said that whoever it was had been living off of wild animals, and then gestured to the trees behind the hole. That smell emanating from the hole was the scent of rotting animal carcasses. I asked them why would anyone want to live in a hole in my backyard, and the officers told me they had no idea. A few moments later, one of the forensic team had come out of the hole and handed me something in a plastic bag. It was a photograph of myself, taking a walkthrough of the house with the realtor. I slid another one out from behind it, and it was me going to work sometime later. I have no idea who took these photos of me, but then the forensic officer said something that chilled me to the core. Those are just the ones taken of you. The officers told me they'd keep in touch and to call them if anything else happens. They cleared out most of that hole, but I was left to fill it in. So that's what I did. I bought some dirt and spent the last few days filling it up as best I could. I don't know who could have been living under my backyard, or for what purpose. But what I do know is that they're still out there, somewhere. And every time I step outside, I can't help but get the feeling like I'm being watched. The other day, my son and I were watching an old horror movie on TV. During one of the scenes, he asked me what the scariest thing to ever happen to me was. I thought for a moment and smiled down at him. I told him that it was the day I decided to marry his mother. He just groaned, stating that getting married isn't scary at all. I just rubbed his head and told him that it was time for bed. While my son thought I was just making another dad joke, I wasn't lying, not by a long shot, but he was much too young to hear the real story. After putting him to bed, I thought back to that night and my long walk home. I've decided to write the story down, a story I've never told anyone, while the memory is still at the forefront of my mind. Way back when my wife and I first started dating, we both lived in a sleepy little rural town. At the time, I was commuting to and from the city for work. The trip sucked. Not to mention my father had given me his beater of a truck for a birthday present. Might sound like I'm ungrateful, but you gotta understand. Most of my paycheck went right into keeping that thing running. I can't tell you how many summers that truck had broken down on me. The day it happened started out like any other. I had gotten ready for work, and when I stepped outside to hop into my truck, I noticed that it was unusually cold outside. Although it was the tail end of summer, a chill like this was uncommon. I shivered slightly as I zipped up my hoodie before hopping into the truck. Taking a moment to breathe some warmth into my hands, I turned the key and the ignition just squealed. I tried again. Nothing. I then slammed my fist onto the steering wheel, cursing this bucket of bolts. And then on the third time, the engine sputtered to life. I quickly turned on the heater and began my drive to work. The drive to work was a long one. It was nearly an hour and a half each way. Although I lived in a little town, the road connecting to the city itself was a long and desolate one. On either side of the road were vast fields that reached out into nearby forests. This scenery went on for miles before the outskirts of the city slowly came into view. I never did like driving on that road. I couldn't tell you why, as it was just a weird feeling I had in my gut. Regardless, work was work, and I made that drive anyway. Every day. I arrived at work without issue, and everything seemed normal. I was just about to finish my shift when my boss had asked me to stay a few hours late. He said I'd make overtime for it and I needed the money, so I agreed. My shift dragged into the night, and I didn't leave until around 11 p.m. As I stepped out into the parking lot, that chill I felt earlier only seemed to have worsened. I rubbed my hands together as my body trembled slightly. I jogged over to my truck and hopped inside. I held my breath as I turned the key, and much to my surprise, the truck started on the very first go. A smile crept onto my face as I pulled out of the parking lot and began my journey home. Driving through the city, there were hardly any other cars on the road. This made navigating the streets much easier. Around 20 minutes of driving, I had reached the outskirts of the city. Turning onto that long stretch of road, I noticed a thin layer of fog beginning to form along the edges of the fields. I kept a close eye on the road in front of me and continued driving. 15 minutes had passed since I had pulled onto that road, when suddenly, a loud noise boomed from under the truck's hood. Immediately following that sound, the momentum in the truck slowed, causing me to lurch forward. I began belting out profanities and the truck gingerly rolled onto the shoulder of the road. A thick layer of steam was seeping out of the edges of the hood, which seemed to almost meld with the fog outside. I sighed and rested my head on the steering wheel for a moment. After mentally preparing myself, I shoved open the door and stepped outside. I used my sleeves to crack the hood open, and a mess of steam and smoke came pouring out of it. There was no way I was going to fix this, especially not with how late it was. I looked back in the direction of the city, which I could no longer see, then down the road towards home. Unfortunately, this took place in a time before cell phones, so I was unable to simply call for a tow truck. My only option was to walk. In my haze of driving, I thought I had been driving on the road for quite a while, and that my town was only a short trek away. I locked up my truck, zipped up my hoodie, and began walking. If any of you have ever walked along an empty road in the middle of the night, alone, then I'm sure you're aware of just how eerie that can be. On top of that, the thin layer of fog had started to become more pronounced as time went on. Between the dark and the fog, I would often find my eyes catching sight of things that weren't truly there, various shapes obscured in the distance before fading entirely. As I walked, the temperature seemed to fluctuate. One moment it'd be freezing, almost to the point of numbing my entire body. Then the next it'd be sweltering, and I'd have to unzip my hoodie to get some respite. Eventually, as I continued, I saw something in the distance. The fog slightly parted as I approached. It looked to be a car on the side of the road. I could feel a knot beginning to form in my throat as I drew closer. It wasn't a car. It was my truck. I stared with disbelief as the frame became more apparent. This was impossible, as I had been walking in a straight line since I had started. Suddenly, as I was within 20 feet, I heard something coming from the other side of it. It sounded like crying. A low wailing sob met my ears, though I couldn't see where it was coming from. I reached the rear of the truck and rested a hand on the tailgate just to be sure that it was really there. It was. As I walked around the side of it, the crying seemed to get louder and louder. I leaned my head around the front of the truck and saw something, sitting off on the side of the road. It appeared to be a person, clutching their knees to their chest and sobbing uncontrollably. I wasn't sure what to do. A part of my mind was telling me not to approach, while another part was urging me to help. Instead, I simply called out to whoever it was and asked them if they were all right. As soon as a sound left my lips, the crying ceased instantly. The silence that filled the void was palpable. I looked around to make sure nothing else was around before asking once again. Then, a new sound began to cut through that silence. It was so loud it seemed like it would carry on for miles. It was the sound of bones cracking and dislocating. I watched as whatever this was began to stand up. When I thought it had finished standing, I was wrong. It continued to grow even more larger, the popping of bones into sockets becoming slower. It had to have been around 12 feet tall. It turned around to face me, and I instinctively screamed. It was horrifying. It wore no clothing. It was just smooth gray skin from head to toe. Its body seemed to almost blend with the fog drifting around us. Its head was unsettling. Just seeing something with an upside-down face was enough to send a paralyzing fear throughout my body. Its face didn't look natural either, and not just because of its orientation. It was as if the face didn't truly belong to it, as if it had been stolen. It let out a gasping shriek in my direction, and I stumbled back into my truck. A sound like the ripping of fabric could be heard as the creature before me began to change. It convulsed and twitched as it stood there. When it was finished, it had sprouted 5 new arms out from its body. It was wholly a walking nightmare. My entire body was shaking as I struggled to back away from it. The creature outstretched a hand towards me, and the fingers barely grazed my cheek before I reeled back. I ran over to my truck and was nervously trying to unlock it. My hand shook so violently that I dropped my keys in the dirt below my feet. as the creature slowly lumbered around my truck. I did the only other thing I could think of in that situation, and that was to run. I ran past that thing, dodging another outstretched hand, and down the road for as long as I could. I had been running for so long my lungs were on fire and my legs were screaming. Eventually, my sprint turned into a jog, then the jog turned into a walk. I gasped and wheezed the entire time. Despite my exhaustion, I maintained a brisk pace as I could faintly hear the sounds of shuffling behind me. Whether it was the creature or something else, I wasn't sure, but I didn't want to find out. Just when I thought my legs were going to give out on me, I saw a break in the distance. The fog gave way to various buildings. I had finally made it back to town. I made it home. Although my entire body was aching, I found some renewed energy to lightly jog the rest of the way home. The next day, I called a tow truck and my girlfriend gave me a lift out to where I had parked my truck. The fog had lifted completely, and I managed to find my keys in the dirt where I had dropped them. Even though she had to be at work soon, I asked her if she would stay with me until the tow truck arrived, and without hesitation, she said, "I'm not going anywhere." That was the very moment I knew I would marry her. I don't know what exactly happened that night, or why I've neglected to tell anyone this story for so long. I guess I just wanted it to be a nightmare to forget, a story lost to time. But I doubt that will ever happen. I doubt I will ever truly forget that terrible night and that long walk home. The sounds of chittering keyboards and the low conversations are the first thing I notice as I step off the elevator. Catherine is once again on her phone with her daughter in the break room, chatting about another relationship issue. Joe is in there with her. I can tell he's just trying to enjoy a bit of time to himself as he nurses his coffee. Bill stands next to the water cooler in the early morning, waiting for anyone to meet his gaze to initiate conversation. My eyes never leave the ground. Christine is nice enough, though her bubbly personality is a lot to take in this early in the morning. Eric is reminiscing with Matt at his cubicle. They're talking about who won the big game the previous night. I slowly navigate through multiple aisles before finding my cubicle to the far back of the room. I sit down at my desk and log onto the computer to start my day. I sit there for hours, inputting number after number into various spreadsheets. This goes on until my watch beeps, informing me it's time for lunch. I walk back through the aisles and into the break room. Bill is speaking with Joe. His rough voice grates my ears as I enter. I can instantly tell Joe is uncomfortable. He can never seem to get some peace to himself. Luckily, my presence goes unnoticed, and I eat my sandwich in solitude off in the corner. I return to work and continue processing numbers for the remainder of my shift. The watch beeps a second time, signifying my shift has come to an end. One by one, we all slowly file out of the office like robots, before loading into that metal box to take us to the lobby. I stare out of the nearby window looking at the cityscape from the 38th floor of this building. The view is nice, and it gives me an excuse not to interact with anyone. I finally step into the elevator and ride it all the way to the bottom. Some of my coworkers give me a cursory goodbye and I return a nod before hopping into my car and driving back to my apartment. That is my work life, for better or for worse. Some of you might think it's a boring existence, and of course you'd be right. I'm that character that you've often seen in sitcoms and TV shows about offices. Not the one people make fun of, mind you, but the one in the back. One of the extras that nobody pays any mind. Somebody that never has anything happen to them ever. I don't mind it though, being the guy that no one interacts with. I'd rather just show up to work, do my shift, and head home for the night. I have been working as an analyst at this company for close to 4 years now. During those 4 years, the weirdest thing I've ever seen happen there was when Bill used the soda machine, and upon pressing a single button, all of the cans came pouring out of it. I remember it vividly because Bill likes to tell it to anyone who will listen, even if you've heard it multiple times before. That was until a few days ago when something else happened in that building. Something that I can't explain. It started out as just another average day. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened when I had gotten up, nor had anything happened on my commute to work. I was simply driving along, listening to the radio as my building grew in the distance. I parked in my usual spot and walked towards the entrance. After passing through the doors, I nodded to Peter, one of the security guards that monitors the lobby. I walked past him, rounding the corner to the elevators. Now, it's not unusual for me to ride the elevator by myself. There have been many days where I took the lone journey up to my floor. It only takes about a minute to arrive. I pressed the call button and waited. I glanced around, not seeing anyone in the vicinity. When I turned to look back at the elevator, it was sitting open before me. I thought it was odd that I hadn't heard its arrival, or the heavy metal door sliding open. I looked down at my watch and stepped inside. On the panel, I found the number 38 and pressed it, and waited as the door silently slid shut. I watched as the numbers above the door steadily increased. This is when things started to take a turn. The elevator reached the 38th floor, but it didn't stop. It passed the 39th, and then the 40th. It continued to rise higher and higher. I looked down at the panel to make sure I had pressed the correct button, and the little 38 was still illuminated. It hit the 50th floor, and then it hit the 51st. When that happened, I felt a wave of panic and confusion wash over me. I stared at that glowing 51 on the screen in disbelief. There were only 50 floors to this building. The number didn't stop increasing, however. It continued climbing. Not sure of what I should do, I pressed the emergency stop button, but that did little to deter it. I thought I was having some sort of hallucination, or perhaps I was still at home dreaming. The elevator shuddered for a moment, before the momentum finally came to a rest. The small LED screen read 88. The 88th floor was where this elevator had decided to stop. I wondered about what would happen next. Would the elevator suddenly begin dropping from the sky? Would I wake up back in my own bed? As my mind raced, the door in front of me opened. There was a floor in front of me. I thought maybe the elevator had simply gone to the 50th floor and that the small screen was malfunctioning. I peeked out into the corridor and I could hardly see much in front of me. There were no lights on this floor. Everything was dark, just barely illuminated by the light within the elevator. From what I could see, it appeared to be just another floor to this building. There were obvious shapes of cubicles and other office decor spread about, though obviously untouched. I wondered if this had been some kind of prank, orchestrated by some of my coworkers, but quickly pushed that thought out of my mind. I tried pressing the lobby button in the elevator, but the light remained on the 38. After that, I began pressing all of the buttons to see if anything would happen, but nothing. The elevator was stationary, and the floor before me was beckoning. I stuck my head out and looked around. I called out to the darkened area asking if anyone was around, but nothing responded. Against my better judgment, I stepped out of the elevator and into the office space. Simply stepping onto that floor, I could feel the tension in the air shift around me. What was once a neutral space had now become one of impending danger. At least, that's how it felt to me. My eyes drifted from left to right. The whole area just seemed to be an abandoned office floor. As my eyes turned to focus on the path ahead of me, I saw something that made me freeze in mid-step. There was someone on the far end of the room. though it was too dark to see it clearly. I called out to them, asking where I was, but they didn't answer. Whoever it was coming towards me. It stepped within the light of the elevator behind me. It was a man. He wore a torn up and disheveled business suit. Cuts and gashes marred his face. His wide eyes conveyed a desperate look of fear. He reached out a hand towards me and I wanted to back up, but my legs wouldn't move. A raspy voice left the man's lips. "You have to go," he said, "before it finds you." After he said that, I heard a noise coming from the back of the room. A sound like a growl emanated from the shadows. I could see two eyes like burning coals shimmering in the dark. I looked to the man once more and he just pointed past me before telling me to leave once again. I turned and glanced back at the elevator. When I turned back to offer to help the man out of this place, he was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. The only thing left were those glowing red eyes which were much closer than before. I nervously shuffled backwards into the elevator and began pressing the buttons repeatedly. Nothing was happening. I could feel my breathing hasten as I struggled against the panel. In the room, the sound of growling echoed louder, almost as if it were a dog preparing to attack. I slammed my fist against the panel and the door finally shut. As soon as they did, a loud crash vibrated on the other side of the door. The numbers began to rapidly descend in the elevator, and it eventually came to a stop on the 38th floor. The door opened up once again and I saw all of my coworkers standing in front of the elevator. They all looked at me with confused expressions before Bill entered the elevator saying, "Better late than never, huh?" I asked him what was going on and he said that they were all heading home, that work was over for the day. I had never been more confused and happy to see my coworkers in my life. I thought I had been on that floor for only around 20 minutes or so, but apparently I had been up there for 8 hours straight. Most of my coworkers had just assumed I was sick and were surprised to find me in the elevator. Still, none of them asked me what I was doing in there, and I was silently grateful for that. Like I said before, I can't explain what happened that day. I don't know how it was possible to go 38 floors above the highest floor in this building. I don't know who that injured man was, or where he disappeared to. And I absolutely have no idea what was making that terrible growling noise. But I'm thankful I didn't find out. I've taken some time off to clear my head. I hope it'll do me some good. And once I get back to work, I think I'll be taking the stairs from now on. Going on a hike can be very therapeutic and is great exercise. At least, that's what my ex-girlfriend said when she first took me hiking. It started out as just some way for us to stay in shape and spend some quality time together. The first time we had gone, I was skeptical. I'm no stranger to exercise, but climbing up a mountain wasn't something I'd consider therapeutic. I remember wheezing and struggling the entire trek up the mountain. I wanted nothing more than to go home and just lay on the couch with a bag of potato chips. Once we had reached the summit though, I'll tell ya, there are very few sights that can match it. During our relationship, her and I would go hiking about twice a month. We always went to the same exact spot and hiked up the same exact trail. After a few months had passed, I was no longer wheezing and was able to truly appreciate the beauty of it. I never really knew how incredible nature actually was. After a while, however, our relationship started to deteriorate. We had grown farther and farther apart, and it seemed like every time we'd speak to one another, it would end in a screaming match. Eventually, it became one fight too many, and we split up. I'll be honest, it was rough for those first couple of weeks. The realization didn't fully hit me until I was stepping out of my car and onto that dirt trail. It had become such a habit that I didn't even realize I was alone. Since I had already made the drive up to the mountain, I figured might as well. That first hike alone was disheartening, but surprisingly, she was right. It did end up being quite therapeutic. Making it to the top all on my own, I felt empowered, and decided that I wanted to continue hiking regardless. So, for the last 2 years, I've gone hiking twice a month, up the same trail, on the same mountain. I did, however, change the days I went though, just in case she still continued to hike up there as well. I didn't want to deal with the awkwardness of seeing her up on the trail. Yesterday, however, was the last time I'll ever go hiking in my life. The day started out as any other. I woke up, got ready, grabbed my pack, and drove up to the mountain. It had been raining all week prior, so I made sure to bring along a sturdy pair of boots just in case. When I arrived, I stared at the swinging sign on a metal chain. It read, "Rock slide, trail closed." I huffed and got back in my car. I thought about going home, and in hindsight, I should have done just that. But instead, I was adamant about maintaining my routine. I drove around to the other side of the mountain, which didn't take me very long. It wasn't that big of a mountain. I found a spot that appeared to be a clearing of some kind. It looked like an area for hikers to disembark and make their way up the mountain. As I pulled up, I saw a dirt trail leading through the trees, though it was much more overgrown than the other path. I looked around and saw that this path had no sign, so I figured that the rock slide had happened on the other side of the mountain. I grinned, inhaled deeply, and began my hike. This path was much more difficult than the other. It took me nearly twice as long to make it halfway up than it did on the other path. I ducked under branches, pushed between trees, and climbed over boulders. I was beginning to wonder if this was actually worth it, when suddenly I stepped out into a clearing. It was astounding. It seemed like a little pocket of nature safely preserved by the towering trees around it. There was a small stream lined with flowers running through it, with some deer scampering off in the distance. It looked like a scene out of a Disney movie, to be honest. Upon arriving there, I felt some renewed energy pour into me, and I continued onward. After 2 more hours of walking, I finally broke through the foliage and arrived at the top. As I stood up there catching my breath for a few moments, I looked around and enjoyed the view. I had never been on this side of the mountain before, so I wondered if I could see anything different. It didn't take me very long to notice a small cabin about halfway down the mountain, not too far from where I hiked actually. I wondered who could be living in such seclusion up on the mountain. As I stared at it from high above, still steadying my breath, I thought I saw something move in the trees near it. I stared a few moments longer to see if I could see it again, but there was no more movement. Suddenly, a group of birds flew out from the surrounding trees, and I thought that must have been what I had seen earlier, just a bird. My curiosity wasn't entirely satiated though, so I decided that upon my descent, I'd try to pass by that cabin. Getting to it was much more difficult than heading back down the way I came. It was like the trees were purposefully blocking my attempts to get any closer. After nearly an hour of pushing my way through the brush, I stepped out into where the cabin rested. The very first thing I noticed about it was that it appeared to be abandoned. The windows seemed to have been shattered long ago. The wood was slowly rotting away in places and had a dark discoloration to it. The wooden front door seemed to sway and knock off the doorframe almost like a wind chime. This was clearly some hunter's cabin from long ago that had been neglected for many years. The sun was nearly behind the mountain as I stepped onto the wooden porch, my heavy boots making the wood below my feet creak painfully. Despite its age though, the cabin was surprisingly well made. A lot of time and effort went into its construction. I admired the carefully carved wood as I walked up to the door. I reached out and gently pulled the door open. It only relented a soft squeak of the hinge before opening fully. I peered inside, and though it was starting to become dark out, I could still see the interior clearly. The door opened up into a living area, with racks and shelves and a small couch. I walked inside, taking care not to step on any rotting wood. To my left was a door which seemed to open to a small washroom kitchen area. With just a passing glance, it appeared to be empty. I walked down the short hallway, and there were two doors, both on my left and right. I opened the one on my right first. It was a bedroom. The bed had long since been overtaken by fungus and random plant life. I backed out of the room and pushed open the door on my left. This appeared to be a study of some kind. I walked inside and noticed a stale, musty scent to the air. I looked around and nothing appeared to be out of the ordinary. That was until I saw something peeking out from behind the desk. It looked like a boot. Making my way around it, my pace slowly came to a stop. I think I had found the owner of the cabin. It was a man. At least, I think it was due to the clothing, though the skeleton still made it difficult to tell. The clothes seemed to have been torn up, probably due to wild animals, I thought. I wondered if the person had a heart attack or some sort of accident. I then thought about how terrible it must have been to have died up here all alone. Just then, I heard a noise that sounded like the front door swinging shut. I felt my body freeze in place. I waited and listened for a minute or two. After not hearing anything, I thought it must have just been the wind blowing the door shut. When I felt a relieving breath leave my lips, I heard the floor outside the study creak. Something was in the cabin with me. I quietly backed up behind where the study door opened up and pressed my back flat against it. A voice, like a ragged whisper, drifted down the hall. "Hello," it said. It sounded like an old man, or at least older than I was. I'm not sure why, but I kept my mouth shut and waited. Another voice, this time louder. "Who's out there?" When I heard them say this, it sounded odd. It didn't seem like the correct way to ask if someone was inside the cabin. Just as I had this thought, the door on my left began to move slightly. It opened up, but I was still behind it, so the door just gently rested against me. I could still see around the frame, however. Whatever had opened the door was crawling on the ground. My eyes grew wider and wider with each passing second. Its grayish skin and disformed figure were unlike anything I had seen before. Inhumanly long fingers with sharpened nails quietly pressed into the wood in front of it. Long, disjointed feet pushed the rest of the body along. I remember thinking that it sort of looked like Gollum from Lord of the Rings, or maybe a hairless dog. It crawled slowly before climbing up onto the desk in the room, and it looked down at the skeleton before that same voice sounded. "Who's out there?" I realized at that moment that the voice was coming from this thing. Just then, my body weight shifted and the floor beneath my feet creaked. The thing on the desk snapped its head to me. Its face was smooth, with two gray eyes, and a mouth like a cavern of teeth below them. It reared back and unleashed a deafening shriek at me. I quickly swung around the door, slamming it shut behind me. I dashed out of the cabin, nearly falling onto my face off the porch. My rapid breathing was doing little to quell my panicked state as I forced my way through trees and over rocks. I didn't know exactly where I was going, I just knew it was down the mountain. My lungs were starting to sting in my chest, but I kept my pace up as long as I could. After nearly an hour of running, my foot slipped on a slick rock, and I fell end over end through trees and brush. I could feel scrapes and scratches forming on my face as well as bruises beginning to form on my body. I came to a rest in the mud and nearly lost consciousness. My eyes shot open a moment later, however, as I heard a rustling of bushes nearby. I scrambled back up and continued moving down the mountain, now with more of a limp. After nearly 10 more minutes of limping down the mountain, I exited the trees not too far from where I had parked my car. Seeing this gave me a hope I had never felt before. As I approached, I began to feel my injuries more and more. I hobbled inside my car and safely drove home. I've been lying on my couch with multiple ice packs ever since I got home. I gave my ex a call this morning and I asked her if she still hiked up on that mountain. She told me that she did, and I told her exactly what I'll tell all of you right now. If you ever feel the urge to go camping or hiking up on a mountain, don't. Or at the very least, don't go up there by yourself. There is something living in those forests. Something terrifying. And it's something you don't ever want to see for yourself.